Margie Bennett escaped into the back seat of a shadow to escape a monster, only to find herself at the feet of a dragon. Sitting beside her is the most feared, dangerous Korean mafia boss. The silence in the basement apartment was always heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket that tasted of damp concrete and the metallic tang of Donald's cheap beer. For 5 years, I had learned to move through this silence like a ghost, measuring my footsteps so the floorboards wouldn't groan, regulating my breath so it didn't disrupt the air around him. I was a master of being invisible, a woman who had been convinced that her heavy frame was a stain on the world, a burden Donald graciously tolerated. But that morning, the silence was broken by a vibration, a low mechanical hum that shouldn't have existed. It came from beneath the bathroom sink, tucked behind a rusted pipe and a stack of moth-eaten towels. My fingers, trembling from the habitual fear that Donald might walk through the door at any second, pulled back the silver duct tape. A burner phone, a cheap plastic device that felt like a live wire in my hand. I shouldn't have looked. 5 years of conditioning screamed at me to put it back, to stay in my lane, to keep navigating the eggshells. But the survival instinct I thought Donald had crushed years ago flared up. I swiped the screen. The messages were a ledger of my existence, but I wasn't listed as a person. I was a unit, a consignment. The girl is healthy, big, strong. She'll last a long time in the overseas circuit, Donald had typed. Before I tell you what happened next to Margie, if you are already enjoying this story, click on the like button, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into it. The response from an unknown number made the blood in my veins turn to ice. Market rate is 20 grand. If the shipment moves Friday, your gambling markers are cleared. Bring her to the Eclipse garage. Don't leave marks on the face. My stomach lurched. The yellowing bruise on my arm, the one I'd received 3 days ago because I bought the wrong brand of coffee, seemed to throb and rhythm with my racing heart. I wasn't just a punching bag anymore. I was a currency. Donald hadn't just been breaking my spirit. He had been preparing the inventory. Every insult about my weight, every comment about how no one else would want me, had been a calculated move to ensure I wouldn't run before the check cleared. He was going to sell me like a piece of livestock to pay for a few bad hands on the poker table. A sudden roar echoed from the street, the familiar, aggressive rumble of Donald's vintage Camaro. He was home early. The cold terror that had paralyzed me for years suddenly snapped, replaced by a white-hot clarity. Panic stripped away my logic, leaving only the raw animal need to survive. I didn't grab a bag. I didn't look for my ID. I simply bolted for the back door, the burner phone still clutched in my hand like a death warrant. As I burst into the humid morning air, I realized the man I had shared a bed with was no longer just an abuser. He was a hunter, and the smallness I had spent years trying to achieve was no longer an option. If I wanted to live, I had to run until I found a world where Donald Chris was nothing more than a shadow. I didn't know then that I was running straight out of the mouth of a wolf and into the lair of a dragon. I only knew that I was no longer a unit on a ledger. I was a woman who was finally, desperately, taking up space. The sky over the city didn't just rain, it wept in heavy gray sheets that blurred the neon signs into bleeding smears of red and blue. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, every step jarring through my frame as my sneakers slapped against the oil-slicked pavement. The humid air of the morning had turned into a cold, biting gale that soaked through my thin tank top in seconds. But I didn't feel the chill. I only felt the vibration of the burner phone in my pocket and the phantom roar of the Camaro's engine echoing in my skull. I turned a sharp corner, my shoulder clipping a brick wall, and for a second the world tilted. I looked back.
Through the veil of rain, I saw the twin amber glow of headlights swinging around the bend 2 blocks away. Donald wasn't driving, he was stalking. He knew these streets like the back of his hand, and he knew my stamina was failing. He was waiting for me to collapse, waiting for the moment I realized that there was nowhere in this city he couldn't reach. Every red light I sprinted past felt like a countdown. 5 years for 20 grand. The math of my life circled my head, a cruel taunt. I reached the commercial district, where the skyscrapers loomed like silent giants, their glass faces indifferent to the woman dying 1,000 deaths on the sidewalk below. My vision began to swim, the exhaustion finally overriding the adrenaline. Then I saw it, the Eclipse Hotel. It was a monolith of black marble and gold accents, a fortress for the kind of people who didn't know what a gambling debt felt like. Its underground parking garage yawned like a dark mouth at the end of a private ramp. It was a place where people like me were usually escorted out by security, but as the Camaro's engine grew louder, a predatory snarl approaching from the rear, I realized it was my only sanctuary. I lunged for the ramp, my feet skidding on the wet concrete as I descended into the bowels of the building. The transition was instant. The roar of the storm was replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of runoff from the luxury cars parked in the shadows. The air here smelled of expensive exhaust and subterranean damp. I scrambled deeper into the gloom, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would crack a rib. Behind me, at the top of the ramp, the Camaro screeched to a halt. The door slammed, a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space.
"Margie, I know you're in here, you ungrateful bit." Donald's voice bounced off the concrete walls, distorted and monstrous. "You think you can just run? You belong to me. I've got people waiting for you." Panic, raw and jagged, stripped me of my last shred of logic. I couldn't go back out, and there were no stairs in sight. I was trapped in a labyrinth of steel and shadows. That's when I saw the black sedan, its rear door slightly ajar, a sliver of warmth and leather invitation in the darkness. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just dove. I tumbled into the darkness of the sedan, my body instinctively curling into the smallest ball possible. I jammed myself between the front and back seats, pressing my cheek against the plush leather floorboards. The door clicked shut with a muffled, expensive thud that seemed to swallow the sounds of the garage. Outside, the world was a cacophony of Donald screaming and the frantic pounding of my own pulse. But inside, the air was heavy with a terrifying, pressurized stillness. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the stale beer and cheap tobacco that had defined my life for 5 years. This was different. It was the scent of old money and cold steel, a mixture of expensive sandalwood cologne, rich Italian leather, and something sharp, like the ozone before a lightning strike. My lungs, accustomed to the thin, panicked air of the basement, struggled to draw in the richness of it. I lay there, paralyzed, my heavy frame shuddering with every gasp I tried to suppress. I was so close to the floor that I could feel the vibration of an engine that hummed with more power than Donald's Camaro could ever dream of. I expected a driver to shout or for a hand to grab my hair and drag me back into the rain. But there was silence. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the dim amber glow of the cabin's accent lights. I dared to tilt my head back just an inch. That was when I saw him. A man sat in the rear seat, just inches above where I lay hidden. He didn't look down at me immediately. He was draped in a tailored white shirt, the fabric so crisp it looked like it had been carved from marble. His posture was the definition of absolute control, relaxed, yet radiating a dormant violence that made the air feel thick. His hand rested on his knee, a hand that looked like it could crush stone. My breath hitched.
peeking out from beneath the cuff of his shirt, a sprawling, vibrant tattoo of a coiled dragon began its ascent up his forearm. The ink was deep, the colors shifting in the low light, the dragon's eyes seemingly watching me. It wasn't the crude, blurred ink of the men Donald associated with. This was art. This was a mark of rank. This was a warning. I realized then that I hadn't just hidden in a car. I had crawled into a predator's den. The man above me held his phone to his ear, listening to someone speak in sharp, clipped Korean tones.
He didn't speak a word, but his presence was a physical weight against my chest. He was the dragon the city whispered about in the dark. Im Seok. Then he shifted. The phone was lowered. The silence in the sedan deepened until I could hear the faint ticking of a watch that probably cost more than my life was worth on Donald's burner phone. I stopped breathing entirely, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't scream. He didn't move to strike. He simply turned his head, his dark, bottomless eyes locking onto mine as I lay huddled at his feet. In that gaze, there was no pity, only a terrifying clinical assessment. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't being looked at as a burden or a commodity. I was being seen by a man who looked like he knew exactly how much blood it took to keep a secret. Im Seok didn't flinch. He didn't recoil as if I were a stray dog that had soiled his pristine interior. He simply sat there, his presence radiating a cold, calculated power that seemed to vacuum the oxygen right out of the cabin. His gaze traveled slowly from my wide, watering eyes down to where my fingers were white-knuckled against the floor mats. Who is he? The question wasn't asked with curiosity. It was a demand for data delivered in a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. I just held up the burner phone, the screen still glowing with the messages that detailed my market value. Im Seok reached down, his fingers cool and steady, brushing against my trembling ones as he took the device. He read the texts in a matter of seconds. I saw the muscle in his jaw flex, a solitary sign of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Then he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on my upper arm where the yellow and purple map of Donald's fingers was exposed under the harsh LED accent lights of the car. To Donald, those marks were trophies of ownership. Under Im Seok's clinical gaze, they looked like an insult to his territory. He thinks he can trade what he does not own, Seok murmured more to himself than to me. He looked at the dragon tattoo on his hand, then back at me. You chose this car for a reason, Margie Bennett. You didn't just want a hiding spot, you wanted a fortress. Outside, a heavy fist slammed against the tinted glass of the rear door. I shrieked, pressing my back against the front seat, trying to vanish into the leather. Donald's muffled roar penetrated the insulation, full of the entitlement that had kept me prisoner for 5 years.
Im Seok didn't look at the window. He didn't even acknowledge the man screaming inches away. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand on the top of my head, a gesture that was surprisingly grounding. It wasn't a touch of affection, it was a touch of claim. "Look at me," he commanded. I forced my eyes up to meet his. The man outside is a scavenger. He hunts in the light because he is afraid of the dark. But you just stepped into the deepest shadow in this city. He leaned closer, the scent of sandalwood and steel wrapping around me like a shroud. You are in my world now. In this world, the only debt that matters is the one you now owe me for your life. And in my world, men like him, they do not follow. He didn't wait for my answer. He tapped the glass of the partition twice. The engine, which had been a low rhythmic purr, suddenly surged with a violent, controlled energy. Sok looked back at the window, his eyes turning into shards of ice as he watched the silhouette of Donald through the tint. "I've been looking for a reason to remind this city why they fear the dragon," he whispered, his thumb grazing the edge of my bruise. "Stay down. By the time we reach the gates, you will realize that the monster you fled is nothing more than an insect under my heel." The sedan began to move, gliding forward with a predatory grace. I stayed on the floor, my heart still hammering, but for the first time in 5 years, the fear wasn't about what would happen if I was caught. It was a terrifying, exhilarating realization that I was no longer running. I was being escorted. The sedan was a tomb of silence, but outside, the world was screaming. Through the deep charcoal tint of the window, Donald Criss appeared like a distorted phantom, his face pressed so close to the glass that his breath left a greasy fog on the exterior. He didn't know I was inches away. He didn't know that the floorboard I was huddled on was the only thing separating my throat from his hands. "Margie, open the door!" His voice was muffled by the heavy reinforcement of the car, but the desperation in it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a man who saw $20,000 slipping through his fingers. He pounded his fist against the glass, a rhythmic, violent thud that once would have sent me into a state of paralysis. I flinched with every strike, my eyes darting toward the door handle, my body instinctively preparing for the moment the glass shattered. But the glass didn't shatter. It didn't even vibrate. The car sat like an obsidian mountain, indifferent to the petty rage of the man outside.
I looked up at Sok. He hadn't moved. His back was straight, his chin tilted slightly upward as he watched Donald's shadow through the tint. There was a terrifying disconnect in his expression. He looked bored. To him, the man who had been the architect of my misery for 5 years was nothing more than a flickering glitch in his evening. Donald gripped the door handle, yanking it with a force that rocked his own frame, but the sedan remained locked. He began to kick the tires, his face contorting into a mask of frantic, ugly greed. He started shouting about the Eclipse garage and the markers he had to pay. He was confessing his crimes to a man who made a living out of punishing them. Sok slowly lowered the window, not the one Donald was leaning on, but the one on the opposite side, just an inch. The sounds of the garage flooded in, the screech of tires, the distant hum of the city, and Donald's ragged, pathetic breathing. "He's looking for his investment," Cirque said, softly, his voice cutting through the noise like a razor. He didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on the shadow on the glass. "He thinks the world is a market where everything has a price tag. He doesn't realize some things are held by hands that don't know how to let go." Donald's face suddenly appeared at the front windshield, his eyes wide and bloodshot as he tried to peer through the darkness of the cabin. For a split second, our gazes almost met. I stopped breathing, my heart hammering against the floorboards. He looked like a cornered animal, dangerous, unpredictable, and utterly unaware that he was standing in the mouth of a cave belonging to a dragon. Sok reached into the pocket of his suit and pulled out a heavy, matte black handgun. He didn't point it. He simply laid it on the leather seat next to him, the metal catching the faint amber light of the interior. The presence of the weapon didn't scare me the way Donald's fists did. It felt like an anchor. It felt like the end of a long, terrible era. "Let him scream," Cirque said, his thumb tracing the dragon tattoo on his hand. "The louder he yells, the easier it will be for my men to find him once we drive away. He's making a map of his own grave." The sedan began to roll forward, the electric motor silent and lethal.
Donald lunged after the moving vehicle, his hand sliding off the polished paint as he fell to his knees in the oil and rainwater of the garage floor. I watched him through the rear window, a small, shrinking figure in the darkness, unaware that the shadow he had been chasing was about to swallow him whole. The sedan ascended from the bowels of the garage, the transition from concrete darkness to the rain-blurred neon of the city feeling like a fever dream. I remained on the floorboards, my body still braced for a blow that was no longer coming. Above me, Sok was a statue of composure, his hand resting near the matte black weapon as if it were merely a part of his uniform.
For the first time in 5 years, the air didn't feel thin. I stood in the middle of the dragon's lair, draped in his colors, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was taking up too much space. I felt like I was finally filling it. The stillness of the penthouse was louder than the screams of the city below. As I moved through the vast, open rooms, the silk rugs felt like clouds beneath my bare feet, a jarring contrast to the cold, cracked linoleum of the life I had left behind. I was draped in Sok's white shirt, the heavy cotton a constant reminder of the dragon who now owned my safety. Everything here was curated, expensive, and sharp, a palace built of glass and steel where even the shadows felt intentional. But as I explored the quiet corridors, the luxury began to feel heavy. I found myself walking on the balls of my feet, my muscles tensed, waiting for a floorboard to creak so I could apologize for existing. 5 years of navigating Donald's rages had left me with the habit of shrinking, and here, in a space designed for a king, I felt like a smudge on a masterpiece. I reached for a crystal glass in the kitchen, my hand trembling, and nearly jumped out of my skin when a low, smooth voice cut through the silence. "You are trying to be invisible again, Margie." Sok was standing in the doorway of his study, the amber light from the desk lamp casting long, predatory shadows behind him. He had replaced his undershirt with a black silk robe, and the dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to shimmer in the low light. He wasn't looking at me with the erratic, bulging eyes of an abusive drunk. He was watching me with the terrifyingly calm focus of a man who saw everything as a move on the chessboard. I didn't want to break anything," I stammered, pulling the sleeves of his shirt over my knuckles. He walked toward me, his movements fluid and soundless. He didn't stop until he was deep in my personal space, forcing me to look up. "You cannot break what is already mine, but you must understand that in this house there is only one rule: absolute transparency." He reached out, his cool fingers lifting my chin. "The man you ran from used fear to keep you small. I use order to keep you alive. If you lie to me, if you hide even a breath from me, the protection ends. And in my world, there is no middle ground between sanctuary and the grave." I felt the air thin again, but it wasn't the frantic panic of the garage. It was a cold, sobering realization. Sok wasn't a hero. He was a sovereign. His protection wasn't a gift of kindness. It was a contract of total surrender. As he looked into my eyes, I saw the ghosts of the men who had failed his rules, a flicker of cold violence that made Donald's petty cruelty look like child's play. "Do you understand the price of the shadow you're standing in?" he whispered. I nodded, the fabric of his shirt scratching against my collarbone. I had escaped a monster who wanted to sell me, only to be claimed by a man who demanded my soul as collateral for my safety. I was no longer a unit on a ledger, but I was becoming a piece in a much more dangerous game. The luxury around me, the gold, the marble, the heights, wasn't just a home. It was a golden cage with lethal bars. And for the first time, I wondered if the dragon's protection would eventually cost more than I was prepared to pay. The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water and rusted iron, a cold, hollow space that felt like the final destination for things meant to be forgotten. I stood in the deep shadows of the mezzanine, my hands gripping the cold railing, draped in the heavy white shirt that had become my second skin. Below me, a single industrial light flickered, casting a harsh, surgical glow onto a solitary chair in the center of the concrete floor. Donald looked small. For 5 years he had been the sun around which my world painfully revolved, a giant whose moods dictated my survival. But as he sat bound to that chair, squinting against the light, he looked like a frantic, cornered rat. His leather jacket was torn, his face a mask of sweating, desperate greed. "I don't know who you think you are," Donald yelled into the darkness, his voice cracking with a bravado he didn't possess. "That woman is mine. She's worth 20 grand, and I'm here to collect. You can't just hijack a deal." A slow, rhythmic clicking of leather soles against concrete echoed through the rafters. Sok emerged from the gloom, his white shirt pristine, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the coiled dragon that seemed to breathe in the flickering light. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man examining a broken piece of machinery that was no longer worth the repair. "You speak of debt," Sok said, his voice a low, lethal hum that made the air in the warehouse feel heavy. He stopped a few feet from Donald, his presence dwarfing the other man. "You speak of market rates and shipments, but you are mistaken. You did not come here to collect a payment. You came here because I summoned you to settle an account you didn't even know you owed." Donald's eyes darted around, searching for an exit that didn't exist. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" Sok reached out, his hand moving with a speed that made me gasp. He didn't strike Donald. He simply placed a hand on Donald's shoulder and squeezed. I watched from the shadows as Donald's face contorted in agony, his frame shrinking under the weight of a power he couldn't comprehend. "I am the man who owns the car she chose," Sok whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from Donald's ear. "I am the dragon who found a wounded bird in his nest, and I find that I am very offended by the marks you left on her." He pulled the burner phone from his pocket, the one Donald had used to price my soul, and dropped it onto the concrete. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he crushed it beneath the heel of his shoe. The sound of plastic snapping was like a bone breaking. "You valued her at 20,000, Siak said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "I value her at a price you cannot pay with money. I value her with the silence you are about to provide." I watched, frozen, as the monster who had dominated my life for half a decade began to weep. It wasn't the dramatic, cinematic end I had imagined. It was a pathetic deconstruction. Siak didn't need to raise his voice or his fists. He simply stood there, a force of nature, stripping Donald of his delusion of power. The man who had sold me was now realizing he was the one who had been bought. In the cold light of the warehouse, I realized the man protecting me wasn't just a shield, he was an ending. And as Siak looked up toward the mezzanine, his eyes finding mine in the dark, I knew the debt was finally, bloodily settled. The warehouse was silent again, the air no longer vibrating with Donald's panicked breaths. In the wake of the monster's removal, a strange, crystalline peace settled over the concrete floor. Siak turned away from the empty chair, his shadow stretching long and thin across the industrial space as he walked toward the stairs. He didn't look back at the ruin he had left behind. His focus was entirely on the mezzanine, on the woman draped in his oversized white shirt, who was finally breathing without fear. We returned to the penthouse in a silence that felt different. It wasn't the heavy, pressurized dread of the garage, but the humming tension of an unanswered question.
The city lights below the floor-to-ceiling windows looked like a sea of diamonds, a world of infinite possibilities that had been locked away from me for 5 years. Imsiok stood by the glass, the city reflected in his dark, unreadable eyes. He held 2 items in his hand, resting them on the marble console table. On the left was a plain white envelope containing a first-class plane ticket to London and a thick stack of cash, enough to disappear, to change my name, to finally be small somewhere else where no one knew my history. On the right lay the heavy, matte black handgun he had used to anchor me in the car. "The debt is paid, Manji," his voice a low melodic rumble. "Donald Criss is a ghost. The men he spoke to have been silenced. You are no longer a unit on a ledger. You are free." I looked at the ticket. It was the escape I had dreamed of during the long nights in the basement apartment. It was a chance to return to the world of eggshells, perhaps to find a quieter life where my heavy frame wouldn't be a weapon used against me. But then I looked at the man in the white shirt, the dragon who had looked at my bruises not with pity, but with an invitation to power.
"You have a choice," Siok continued, turning to face me. "You can take the ticket and run until you forget the smell of this car. Or you can stay. But if you stay, you do not stay as a passenger. You stay as the woman who stands beside the dragon. You will never hide on a floorboard again." The 5 years of conditioning whispered to me, telling me I wasn't enough for this world of silk and steel. But the weight of the white shirt on my shoulders reminded me of how it felt to be shielded. I realized that I didn't want to go back to being a ghost in a different city. I wanted to be the storm. I walked past the envelope, my eyes locked on his. I didn't reach for the ticket. Instead, I stepped into his space, reclaiming the room I had been taught to apologize for. I reached out and placed my hand over his, my fingers tracing the ink of the coiled dragon on his skin. "I'm done running," I whispered, my voice steady for the first time in my adult life. "I spent 5 years trying to take up less space. I think it's time I started taking over yours." A slow, rare smile ghosted across Siok's lips, a predatory, prideful thing. He didn't pull away. He closed his hand over mine, pulling me flush against his chest. I wasn't the trembling woman from the garage anymore. I was the new queen of his shadow, and as we looked out over the city together, I knew that the world was finally small enough for me to handle.